Part 1. The Slippery Slope. I never thought I would become a woman who cheats. If you'd asked me 10 years ago when I married Eric, I would have laughed at the very suggestion. We were the perfect couple, the kind you see in engagement photos, with hearty laughter and loving looks. But life has a way of unraveling even the tightest knots, and somewhere along the way, we loosened our grip on each other. It started unnoticed. Little things that I brushed off as meaningless. A late night at work here, a business trip there. Eric and I had always been career-oriented, but somewhere between our promotions and endless commitments, we stopped really seeing each other. I think that's when Adam came in, through the cracks of a marriage that once seemed unbreakable. Adam was a colleague of mine at the marketing company where I worked. He joined the team about a year ago, bringing with him an energy that was both exciting and infectious. He was charming but not forced, effortlessly making the office brighter. At first I admired him from afar, appreciating his wit and ability to make even the most boring meetings bearable. But admiration, as I later realized, is a slippery slope. The first time we really got close was during a project that went awry. An important client was threatening to cancel the contract, and Adam and I were tasked with saving it. We spent countless hours together, brainstorming strategies, finalizing presentations, and staying late in the office. It was during these stolen hours when the rest of the world was asleep, and it was just the two of us that the lines began to blur. It was innocent at first. Conversations about work seamlessly turned into discussions about our personal lives. I found myself sharing things with Adam that I hadn't even told Eric for months: how I felt unappreciated at home, how I missed the spontaneity we used to have, how I sometimes felt like a ghost in my own marriage. Adam listened to me in a way that made me feel heard, which I hadn't felt in a very long time. The first mistake came in the form of a drink after work. The project was successful, and the team went out to celebrate. Eric had gone out of town for a conference, so there was no rush to get home. One drink turned into two, then three, and before I knew it, Adam and I were the last ones left in the bar. I should have left before I crossed the line, but instead I let him drive me home. We sat in his car for what seemed like hours, talking about everything and nothing. The air between us was saturated with something unspoken, something dangerous. When he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, it took my breath away. I had to stop him. I should have gotten out of the car and gone inside. But instead, I leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his fingers linger on my skin for just a second. That was the moment I realized I was in trouble. Because in that fleeting touch, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: desirability. I told myself that it was nothing, that I was just caught up in the moment. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Adam and I found more and more reasons to be alone. Coffee breaks turned into long lunches, meetings became private brainstorming sessions, and every interaction carried an underlying tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge. It was exciting and terrifying at the same time. I kept telling myself that nothing had happened, that I was still loyal to Eric, but that an emotional affair had already begun. I was looking forward to meeting Adam, but I wasn't expecting it. I started dressing more carefully in the mornings, choosing outfits that I knew suited me best. I started wearing perfume again, something I had stopped doing years ago when Eric seemed to barely notice. One particularly late night, it was just Adam and I in the office. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant noise of traffic outside the window filled the silence between us as we worked side by side. I could feel his gaze on me, which lingered for a moment longer. When I finally looked up, he was still staring at me. "I think we need to stop this," I whispered, although I wasn't even sure what this was. Adam didn't pretend not to understand. "Is that what you want?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding against my ribs. Did I want it? I should have said yes. I should have left right then and there. But instead, I hesitated. His hand touched mine, and I felt the warmth of his skin. It was a simple touch, no more than the touch of his fingers, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I had never felt so alive. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Eric's name came up on the screen. Guilt hit me like a cold shower, bringing me back to reality. I grabbed my bag and stood up abruptly. "I have to go," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Adam nodded, his expression readable. "Of course." But as I walked away, I knew it wasn't over. Not at all. Part 2. Crossing the line. The days that followed that night with Adam were filled with unbearable tension. Every glance, every casual touch, every whispered conversation in the office was imbued with an electric charge that neither of us could deny. I told myself that I could keep it under control, that I wouldn't let it go any further. But desire has a way of breaking down even the strongest walls of restraint. It was a Friday evening when everything changed. The office was almost empty, except for a few employees who were staying late to finish their weekly work. I stayed late to finish the report, and Adam did the same. As the clock ticked past 9, it was just the two of us, a familiar scenario that was becoming more and more common. "You need a break," Adam said, leaning against my desk with his trademark smile that made my stomach flutter. I laughed, shaking my head. "And what do you propose?" "Dinner. My treat." I hesitated. I knew what this looked like. I knew what it looked like. But the thought of coming home to an empty house Eric had another work trip for the weekend made my decision easier. "Okay," I agreed, and my voice was softer than I had planned. We ended up in a quiet little Italian restaurant not far from the office. It was dimly lit, intimate, and at the same time exciting and dangerous. Over wine and pasta, we talked about everything but work. He made me laugh, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And when he reached across the table and took my hand in his, I didn't pull it away. "This is dangerous," I mumbled, my heart pounding. "I know," he said, running his thumb over my knuckles. "But I don't want to stop." I didn't want to either. We left the restaurant, walking side by side in the cool night air. When we reached my car, we froze for a moment, both knowing what was about to happen, but not wanting to act first. Adam made the first move, stepping closer, his eyes dark with something I recognized all too well. I could have stopped him. I could have stepped back, gotten in my car, and driven home. But I didn't. When his lips met mine, it was like a dam breaking. Every bit of restraint I was holding on to dissolved in an instant. At first, the kiss was slow, hesitant, like testing the water. But then it deepened, became insistent, absorbing. His arms slid around my waist, pulling me close, and I melted into his touch. When we broke away, we were both out of breath. He leaned his forehead against mine, his hands still on my hips. "Come home with me," he whispered. Reality hit me in an instant. I stood in the parking lot, tangled in the arms of a man who was not my husband. My heart was pounding against my ribs, and my lips were still tingling from his kiss. I wanted him, God. I wanted him, but I wasn't ready to cross that line. "I can't," I said, forcing myself to take a step back. "Not tonight." Adam studied me for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said. "Not today." But the promise in his voice was clear. This was not over. As I drove home, a whirlwind of emotions swirled through my head: guilt, excitement, fear, longing. I knew that I had already done something unforgivable, but I also knew that this was only the beginning. The weekend seemed unbearably long. Eric called several times to check on me, but I could barely concentrate on our conversations. My mind was elsewhere. I replayed the kiss in my head, imagining what would have happened if I had said yes to Adam. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't change. Monday came all too quickly. As soon as I entered the office, I felt Adam's eyes on me. He was leaning against the reception desk, talking to the secretary, but as soon as he saw me, his expression changed. A quiet understanding arose between us, a tacit acknowledgement of what had happened and what was yet to come. We managed to behave normally around our colleagues, but when we were alone, the tension between us was palpable. Every touch of his hand to mine, every shared glance across the conference table, all of this was building up to something inevitable. That day, I found a note on my desk. When I opened it, it took my breath away. "Meet me on the stairs in 5 minutes." My heart was pounding as I stared at those words. I knew I should throw him away, ignore him, pretend nothing had happened. But my hands betrayed me, clutching the paper tightly as I stood up and headed for the stairs. Adam was waiting for me when I arrived. As soon as the door closed behind me, he stepped forward, put his arms around my waist, his breath warm on my skin. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his voice low and insistent. I had to leave. I should have ended it right there. But instead, I let him kiss me again. And this time I didn't pull away. Part 3. There is no turning back. The moment our lips met again on the landing, I knew there was no turning back. The cautious dance we had been playing to avoid the inevitable was finally over. The walls of restraint had crumbled, and we had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Adam's arms found my waist, pulling me to him, his touch rekindling a fire in me that I had long thought had been extinguished. My body reacted instinctively, clinging to him, submitting to the intensity of the moment. The staircase was dimly lit, the muffled sounds of the office outside the door a distant reality to which I was no longer attached. All that mattered was the man in front of me and the warmth that radiated between us. I've wanted this for so long, Adam whispered, touching my skin, his lips tracing my jawline, all the way to my collarbone. A shiver ran down my spine as his breath tickled my neck, sending waves of anticipation coursing through me. I couldn't speak. The weight of my actions was present, lingering in the back of my mind like a whisper of guilt, but it was drowned out by the heady rush of desire. My hands found the back of his head, my fingers running through his hair as I pulled him closer. I wanted to lose myself in him, in this feeling, in the forbidden excitement that came with the realization that we were doing something we shouldn't. A sharp knock on the door in the stairwell startled us both. We scattered, gasping for breath as the reality of where we were and what we were doing hit us. I took a shaky step back, running a hand through my hair, trying to regain some semblance of composure. Later, Adam murmured, his eyes locked on mine with a promise that sent a new wave of anticipation through me. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and quickly exited the stairs, my heart pounding under my ribs. As I walked back to my desk, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I had officially crossed the line, and I couldn't pretend that I hadn't. That night, I lay in bed next to Eric, staring at the ceiling, running through everything in my head. His steady breathing was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside me. I turned on my side, studying his face in the dim light of the bedside lamp. He looked calm, unaware of the storm that had begun to brew beneath the surface of our marriage. I was gnawed by guilt, but it wasn't enough to quench the hunger I felt for Adam. The truth was that I had never felt so alive. The excitement, the mystery, the way he looked at me as if I were the only woman in the world, it was a drug, and I was already addicted to it. The following days blurred together in a fog of stolen moments and heated arguments. We found excuses to be alone, lingered in empty conference rooms, touched each other in the corridors. Every touch, every look, every whispered conversation fueled the fire that burned between us. We were reckless, playing a dangerous game without thinking about the consequences. And then came the night that changed everything. Eric was out of town again. Another work trip that left me alone in our empty house. Earlier that day, Adam had sent me a text, a simple message that gave me a shiver of anticipation. Come see me. I stared at the message for what seemed like an eternity, knowing what it meant, knowing what I was going to do. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to make excuses. It was the moment when I had to commit the greatest betrayal. And I wanted to do it. I stood outside of Adam's apartment, my heart pounding in my chest as I raised a trembling hand to knock. The door opened almost instantly, and there he was, eyes dark with desire, lips curled in a knowing smile. He stepped aside, silently inviting me in, and I crossed the threshold without hesitation. As soon as the door closed, he was on top of me. His hands were everywhere, exploring, demanding, igniting every nerve in my body. I responded in kind, my hands desperately trying to memorize every inch of him. Clothes were thrown aside, inhibitions left behind as we lost ourselves in each other, giving in to the passion that had been building up for so long. It was everything I had imagined and more. He made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, wanted, desired, adored. As we lay tangled together, his fingers lazily running down my back, I realized that there was no going back to the way things were before. But along with this realization came another, much scarier one. What would happen next? Part 4. Cracks in the Facade. The next morning after the night with Adam, I woke up in his bed, tangled in the sheets that still smelled like him. The warmth of his body next to me was soothing in a way I hadn't felt in years, but as I lay there, reality seeped back in. I was married, and no matter how hard I tried to push that truth aside, it now loomed over me like an unmoving shadow. Adam stirred, his arm tightening around my waist, pulling me closer. "Good morning," he whispered against my shoulder, his lips brushing against my skin. I forced a smile, but panic was beginning to bloom inside me. I needed to leave. I needed to get back to the life I had so carelessly put on the line. "I have to go," I whispered, slipping out of his arms. Adam propped himself up on his elbow, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Are you okay?" I wasn't sure how to answer that. Instead, I nodded, reaching for my clothes, trying to pull myself together. I need to get home before Eric gets home," I admitted, hating the way my voice was shaking. Adam was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. "I don't want this to be the last time." I froze, unbuttoning my blouse halfway as I met his gaze. "Adam, we don't have to." He shook his head. "Don't say that. Don't lie to yourself." I didn't answer, because deep down I knew he was right. The drive home was painful. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and the events of the previous night were running through my mind. Passion, excitement, guilt. They fought inside me, fighting for dominance. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat for a long time looking at the house that Eric and I had built. It seemed alien to me now, as if I were entering a life that no longer belonged to me. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. The dishes from the night before were still in the sink. The blanket I had curled up with on the couch was still draped over the armrest. It was as if my betrayal had not happened, as if I could just go back to my role as a devoted wife and pretend that nothing had changed. But something had changed. I had changed. Eric's flight was scheduled to leave in just a few hours, but I felt like I was suffocating inside the walls of our house. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I knew who it was before I even looked at it. "I miss you already." My heart was pounding, and I hated myself for how much I wanted to answer. I put the phone on the table and walked away, forcing myself to focus on something else. I took a shower, washed off his smell, and washed the traces of last night off my skin. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wash away the memories. When Eric finally came home, I expected to feel overwhelming guilt, but instead I felt numb. I greeted him with a hug, let him kiss me, forced myself to smile as he told me about his trip. But inside, I was somewhere else. That night, as he slept next to me, his arm wrapped around my waist in a gesture that was supposed to be reassuring, all I could think about was Adam. How did I let this happen? I told myself that it had to end, that I would leave before it went any further. But even as I made this silent vow to myself, my phone vibrated on my nightstand. "Meet me tomorrow?" And just like that, my resolve began to crack. The next day, I sat at my desk, staring at the screen. The guilt settled in, gnawing at me from the inside. But underneath it was something else, desire, an undeniable attraction to Adam that I couldn't ignore. When I finally looked up, he was standing outside the break room looking at me. He didn't smile, didn't try to act normal. He just caught my gaze, his expression unreadable. I swallowed hard. I should have ignored him. I should have looked away. But instead, I stood up, my legs moving on their own as I walked toward him. "Follow me," he whispered, and I obeyed. We found ourselves in an empty office, with the blinds drawn, an air of expectation in the air. "I told myself I wouldn't see you again," I admitted, my voice barely audible, like a whisper. Adam took a step closer, his fingers tracing my hand. "And yet, here you are." I closed my eyes, wanting to pull back, to leave before I did something I couldn't undo. But when he cupped my face in his hands and tilted my head to meet his lips, every thought, every hesitation melted away. It was insane. It was dangerous. But at that moment, I didn't care. I kissed him back. The romance quickly flared up. Lunch breaks turned into stolen moments in dimly lit corners. Business trips became an excuse to spend the night together. We were reckless, consumed by the passion that gripped us. I told myself that no one suspected anything, that we were careful, that the stolen glances and quiet touches went unnoticed. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and I had no idea how close we were to being found out. One evening, as I sat across from Eric at dinner, pretending to listen to him tell me about a client meeting, my phone buzzed in my lap. Adam. Eric noticed. Who keeps texting you? He asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. I panicked, but I forced a smile. Just work, I lied, placing my phone on the table with the screen facing down. Eric held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. Part 5, Payback. The burden of my double life was suffocating me. Every moment I spent with Adam was a stolen breath, a breath of air before I was plunged back into guilt. But I kept going back again and again, knowing that the moment of reckoning was drawing closer with every lie I told Eric. Eric was no fool. Doubt had taken root in his eyes, and although he didn't look me directly in the eye, I could feel his gaze linger longer than usual, watching, studying, waiting for cracks to appear. And then one evening these cracks made themselves felt. I had just left Adam's apartment after another night of passion. My heart was still pounding from the way his hands moved over me, the way his lips whispered promises that I knew neither of us could keep. I had barely pulled out of the parking lot when my phone rang. It was Eric. A lump formed in my throat. I hesitated before answering, trying to steady my breathing. Hi, I said, forcing myself to sound casual. Where are you? His voice was calm, too calm. I swallowed. Just got off work. It's been a long day. A silence stretched between us, heavy and ominous. Then, quietly, he asked, Are you sure about this? My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean I know, Claire. The car suddenly felt too small, and the air too thick. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind searching for an escape, an explanation, anything that would make this moment not real. I started, but he cut me off. Don't lie to me. Don't lie to me anymore. His voice trembled slightly, the first sign of emotion breaking through his facade. I know about Adam. A sharp breath escaped my lips. The world outside blurred as my vision plunged into a tunnel. Eric, I saw your messages. My hands shook. Of course I had. How could I have been so careless? I'd been so consumed with my own desires that I'd stopped covering my tracks, thinking I was untouchable. How long? His voice was raw, filled with something I couldn't place: anger, heartbreak, or maybe both. I closed my eyes, exhaling shakily. A few months. These words were like a confession, and with them came the weight of my choice. I can't do this over the phone, he said after a long pause. You have to come home. Right away. The drive home was the longest of my life. My mind was running through every possible scenario. Would he scream? Will he cry? Would he leave me? I deserved all of these things. When I finally walked through the door, he was waiting for me, standing in the living room with his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes, usually so warm and full of love, were cold, unreadable. Why? He asked. The question I was most afraid of. How could I explain what I barely understood? I don't know, I admitted in a barely audible whisper. I was lonely. I felt invisible. And Adam, he made me feel alive again. Eric laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Alive? He took a step closer, his jaw clenched. What about me, Claire? What have I made you feel? Guilt scratched at my insides. It's not that simple, isn't it? He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. I loved you. I trusted you. And you threw that away for... what? For a thrill? Tears blurred my vision. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did. His voice broke, and for the first time that night, I saw pain in his eyes. And the worst part is, I don't even know if I was ever enough for you. A sob escaped my chest. You were. You were. He looked away as if my words had physically hurt him. Then why wasn't I enough to stop you? I had no answer. We sat in silence for what seemed like hours. Finally, Eric spoke again, his voice hollow. I can't do this, Claire. Panic flared in my chest. Eric, Please? He shook his head. I need time. Space. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of my betrayal. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. I wanted to beg, to promise that I would make it right. But the truth was that some things cannot be fixed. Some betrayals cut too deep. I'm leaving, I whispered, knowing that I had no right to fight for him to stay. As I packed my bags, the reality of what I had done settled over me like a suffocating fog. I had broken a man who loved me unconditionally. I destroyed the life we had built together. And for what? As I walked out the door, I looked at Eric one last time. He didn't say anything, didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, his face etched with heartache, watching me go. The reckoning had come, and I lost everything. The end.